As I reflect on the power and the promise of God's hand in our lives, I am reminded of the many times I have personally experienced His unwavering strength, especially in moments of profound difficulty. There have been seasons in my life, as I'm sure many of you have faced, when life seemed completely overwhelming. You know, the kind of seasons where the weight of the world feels like it's pressing down on you from every side, when problems pile up, when uncertainties seem to consume you, and when you wonder if you can even stand up under the pressure. I remember a time in my own life when everything felt like it was falling apart. There were family challenges, personal struggles, and ministry pressures that seemed to be too much for me to bear. I had done everything I could in my own strength to manage the situations around me, but no matter how hard I tried, I felt helpless. It was in that season that God graciously reminded me of the unshakable truth of His Word, that His hand would hold me firmly through every challenge I faced. And let me tell you, I had to cling to that promise like never before. There were times when I would sit in the quietness of my study, overwhelmed and uncertain of what was ahead, but I would find myself meditating on the words of Psalm 18:35. You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your right hand supported me. These words weren't just words on a page to me. They were a lifeline, a reminder that in the midst of my deepest struggles, God's hand was with me, holding me, providing for me, and sustaining me. As I reflect on that time, I am reminded of how often we, as human beings, place our trust in everything but the one thing that can actually hold us, ourselves, our own abilities, our circumstances, our strength, our achievements. But when we do that, we soon realize how limited we really are. And it was in that realization that I turned to God, recognizing that I couldn't rely on my own strength. I needed something greater. And there, in the midst of my weakness, I found God's hand, strong and steady, reaching down to uphold me. That hand which created the heavens and the earth was the same hand that would hold me firmly through every trial. I didn't have to fear or despair, because the hand of God was not only sovereign over the universe, but also intimately involved in the details of my life. I saw in those moments that His power was not just a distant reality. It was a present, active force in my life, lifting me when I could no longer stand, providing strength when I was weak, and offering peace when my heart was troubled. In those moments of feeling completely overwhelmed, I realized that God's hand was both my refuge and my strength. It was in His hand that I found the endurance to continue, the peace to rest, and the hope to press forward. I can't help but think about how, as believers, we are often called to walk through difficult paths. Jesus Himself, in John 16:33, told us, "In this world you will have tribulation, but take heart. I have overcome the world." He didn't promise us an easy life, and He didn't promise that we would be exempt from pain and struggle. But He did promise us that He would be with us every step of the way, and that His hand would hold us through it all. And that's what I found to be true in my own life. As I faced those trials, I could feel the reality of God's hand upholding me. There were days when I wasn't sure how I was going to make it through, but somehow, day by day, God's hand kept me steady. It was as though His hand was lifting me when I couldn't lift myself. And it wasn't just about getting through the challenges. It was about the transformation that took place within me. God's hand didn't just sustain me physically. It changed my heart, deepened my faith, and gave me a new perspective on His goodness and sovereignty. Through His hand, I came to understand that the struggles I faced were not without purpose, but that God was using them to shape me, refine me, and ultimately draw me closer to him. And this is not just my story. This is the promise for every believer. God's hand is not reserved for a select few, or only for those who are strong or have it all together. His hand is there for all of us, at all times, through every challenge. In times of weakness, his hand will hold you firmly. In times of grief, his hand will comfort you. In times of uncertainty, his hand will guide you. God's hand is a hand of power, and yet it is also a hand of gentleness, leading us with tender care, holding us with unfailing love, and assuring us that no matter what we face, we are never alone. This truth became incredibly real to me in that season of life, and it has remained a constant source of strength and encouragement. The challenges we face in life are inevitable, but the assurance that God's hand will hold us firmly through them is what enables us to press forward with hope and confidence. So I encourage you today, no matter what you are facing, to trust in the power of God's hand to hold you. His hand is mighty to save, to sustain, and to guide. And when we rest in his hand, we can face every challenge with the peace that comes from knowing that we are secure in his grasp. As I continue to reflect on the powerful truth that God's hand will hold us firmly through every challenge, I can't help but think about the importance of trusting in the unchanging nature of God's hand. In a world where everything seems to shift, where circumstances, relationships, and even our own health can change in an instant, the unchanging nature of God's hand provides an anchor for our souls. I remember a time in my own life when I was going through one of the most difficult seasons I had ever faced. The pressures of ministry, coupled with personal trials, left me feeling completely uncertain about the future. I was struggling to understand what God was doing or how he would bring me through this particular storm. There were days when I felt like I was walking in darkness, uncertain of which step to take next, and wondering how long the struggle would last. But in the midst of my confusion, I was reminded of a powerful truth found in Hebrews 13:8, which says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Those words struck me deeply. In a world where everything changes, where people's attitudes, circumstances, and even our own strength can wane, God remains the same. His hand is constant, unchanging, and reliable. This unchanging nature of God is the very foundation upon which we can rest. It's easy to place our trust in things that seem stable or secure. But we all know that earthly things, no matter how firm they appear, are subject to change. But God's hand, his care, his presence, these never change. As I meditated on this truth, I found myself returning to Psalm 125, 1:2, which says, "Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved but abides forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people from this time forth and forevermore." This psalm paints a beautiful picture of the stability that comes when we trust in God. Just as the mountains that surround Jerusalem have stood for centuries, so too does the Lord surround his people with his unchanging care. In those moments when life feels uncertain, when we are faced with challenges that seem insurmountable, we are called to place our trust in God's unchanging hand. His hand will not be moved by the storms that surround us. It remains firm, steady, and unshaken. The world may be unpredictable, but God's hand will always hold us securely no matter the circumstances. This truth has been a comfort to me time and time again throughout my life. When I think back to those seasons when I was struggling with doubt and fear, it was the unchanging nature of God's hand that kept me steady. I could rest in the fact that even when everything around me was uncertain, God was constant, His love was unchanging, and His care would never fail me. This is a truth we can hold on to with confidence. As human beings, we are often at the mercy of things beyond our control. Relationships change, health fails, financial stability can be fleeting, and the world itself seems to be in constant flux, but God's hand will never change. In Psalm 46, 1-2, we read, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea. The psalmist is declaring that no matter what happens in this world, God's hand remains an unshakable refuge for His people. The earth may give way beneath us, and the mountains may be moved, but the hand of God will not be moved. His hand is a constant source of stability in our lives. I remember the times when I would find myself facing challenges that seemed to be beyond my understanding or ability to handle. It was in those moments of fear and uncertainty that I would turn to God's Word. And over again, I would find that God's promises remained steadfast. His care never wavered. His love never faltered. His power never diminished. No matter what life threw my way, I could rely on the unchanging nature of His hand. This truth becomes even more powerful when we consider the sovereignty of God. There is no situation, no trial, no difficulty that is beyond His control. When we trust in the unchanging nature of God's hand, we are trusting in His sovereign ability to hold us firm, even in the most turbulent of times. There were times in my life when I tried to control the outcome of certain situations. I would worry, plan, and attempt to manipulate circumstances to align with my desires. But every time, I was reminded that I was not in control. The more I tried to control, the more anxious I had to control, the more anxious and uncertain I became. However, when I learned to let go and rest in the sovereignty of God, I found a peace that I had not known before. I realized that God's unchanging hand was far more capable of guiding me through life's challenges than my own attempts at control. Proverbs 19:20, one says, "Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand." This verse was a powerful reminder that, though I may plan and prepare, it is ultimately God's purpose and will that will prevail. His hand will always accomplish what He sets out to do, and I can trust in that with my whole heart. I've also learned that this unchanging hand of God is not just a theological concept, but a deeply personal reality. It's easy to think of God's hand as something distant, something out there in the heavens, but in reality, His hand is right here with us, holding us close. I've seen this in the lives of countless believers who have faced hardship and yet have found peace and strength in the unchanging care of God's hand. Whether it's the loss of a loved one, the devastation of illness, or the uncertainty of the future, God's hand is there, offering comfort, support, and guidance. His hand does not falter. His presence is constant, and in that presence, we find the strength to carry on. His hand has not failed me, and I know it will never fail any of you who trust in Him. We are invited to rest in the unchanging hand of God, knowing that no matter what we face, He will hold us firmly. The God who has held the universe together from the beginning of time is the same God who holds our lives in His hands. And there is no greater comfort than knowing that the unchanging hand of God is always at work in our lives, guiding us, protecting us, and holding us steady. So I urge you today, no matter what challenges you are facing, no matter how uncertain or difficult the road ahead may seem, trust in the unchanging nature of God's hand. Rest in the peace that comes from knowing that He is always with you, that His hand will never fail, and that He is fully capable of holding you firmly through every challenge you face. God's hand is our refuge, our strength, and our comfort, and we can be confident that it will never change. His unchanging hand will hold you firmly today, tomorrow, and for all eternity. As I continue to reflect on the truth that God's hand will hold us firmly through every challenge we face, I can't help but think about how vital it is for us to recognize and experience God's hand in our lives during times of difficulty. It's one thing to understand the theological truth that God is with us and will hold us, but it's another thing entirely to experience it in the midst of life's most trying moments. I've been through my fair share of struggles, as I'm sure many of you have, and I can tell you that it is in those moments of hardship that the reality of God's sustaining hand becomes so incredibly precious. I remember a specific season in my life when everything seemed to be going wrong. Ministry pressures, personal struggles, and family challenges seemed to converge all at once. There was a time when I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, feeling completely overwhelmed, wondering how I would make it through the day, let alone the months ahead. It felt as though everything was spiraling out of control, and I couldn't see a way forward. The questions, the doubt, and the fear were all consuming. But it was in those very moments of uncertainty and fear that God's hand became the most real to me. I remember feeling a deep sense of peace settle over me as I sat quietly in prayer, asking God to show me that He was there with me, that He was holding me. And in that moment, the words of Psalm 139:10 echoed in my mind. Even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. I had heard those words many times before, but in that moment, they carried a weight of meaning and comfort that I had never fully grasped. I was reminded that no matter how dark the path seemed, no matter how uncertain the future felt, God's hand was always with me, guiding me and holding me firmly. It wasn't that the circumstances immediately changed or that the pain disappeared, but I found a new strength that came from knowing that I was not facing these trials alone. God's hand was with me, holding me firm through the storm. I think about how, as believers, we are often called to walk through difficulties and hardships. The Christian life is not one of ease and comfort. It is a life marked by challenges, opposition, and sometimes suffering. But in those moments, we are reminded that God's hand is not only present in the good times, but especially in the hard times. It is in the storm that we experience the steadfastness of His hand the most. When we look at the story of the Israelites as they wandered in the wilderness, we see a powerful picture of how God's hand holds His people through life's most difficult moments. They faced hunger, fear, and constant uncertainty, yet God's hand was with them, providing, protecting, and guiding them every step of the way. In Exodus 15:13, Moses sings of God's faithfulness, saying, "In your steadfast love you have led the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode." The Israelites, despite their doubt and complaining, were held securely in God's hand. His hand was leading them, even when they couldn't see the destination. And in the same way, we are held by God's hand. Even when we can't understand what's happening or where the road ahead will lead, God's hand is guiding us through the uncertainty. And we can trust that He is leading us to a place of ultimate good, even when the journey is hard. There have been times in my own life when I felt completely incapable of moving forward. There were seasons of ministry when I was so burdened with the weight of responsibility that I honestly didn't know how I could continue. There were family challenges that left me feeling drained and helpless. And yet, As I turned to God in those moments, I experienced His hand holding me steady. I realized that it wasn't my strength that would get me through, but His. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, Paul shares the comforting truth that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. It was in my moments of weakness, when I had nothing left to give, that I experienced the strength of God's hand more powerfully than ever before. God's hand didn't just hold me up physically. It gave me the strength to endure, the peace to trust, and the grace to continue on. I've learned over the years that the more I lean on God's hand, the more I experience His sustaining power. The challenges of life are not going to stop. They will continue to come, but God's hand will continue to hold us. His power is made perfect in our weakness, and it is in those moments when we feel like we can't go on that we are often the most aware of His strength carrying us. As I look back on my life, I can see how God has used each challenge I've faced to deepen my trust in His hand. The trials have not been wasted. They have been opportunities to experience the faithfulness of God in ways I never would have otherwise. When we go through hardship, we often can't see the bigger picture, but we can trust that God's hand is at work, molding us, strengthening us, and preparing us for what lies ahead. I think about the Apostle Paul, who faced incredible hardships throughout his life, and yet he could confidently say in 2 Timothy 4:18, "The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and bring me safely into His heavenly kingdom. To Him be the glory forever and ever." Amen. Paul knew that God's hand would never fail him, that no matter what he faced, God would hold him firmly and bring him through. And that same assurance is available to us today. No matter what we face, God's hand is there, holding us, guiding us, and strengthening us. And it is not just for this life. God's hand will hold us firmly through every challenge. And ultimately, He will bring us safely into His heavenly kingdom. So, as you face the trials and challenges that lie ahead, I want to encourage you to trust in the reality of God's hand holding you. It is not just a theological concept. It is a present, active reality in your life. God's hand is not far off. It is near to you. And when you feel overwhelmed, when you feel weak, when you wonder how you will make it through, know that God's hand is right there with you, holding you firmly and guiding you every step of the way. His hand will not let go, and His care for you will never fail. You are safe in His grip, and nothing, absolutely nothing, can separate you from His love. Trust in His hand today and find peace in the knowledge that He will hold you firm through every challenge you face. As I continue to reflect on the profound truth that God's hand will hold us firmly through every challenge, I am reminded of how often we, as human beings, fail to grasp the depth of God's sustaining strength until we face situations that stretch us beyond our limits. I can recall many times in my own life when I thought I understood the reality of God's support, only to be thrown into circumstances where I had no other choice but to fully rely on His hand to guide and sustain me. One such moment came during a particularly challenging season in ministry. I had always been taught that as a pastor, I should be strong, confident, and in control, someone others could turn to for leadership and guidance. But in the midst of a particularly difficult year, I found myself struggling, questioning whether I was doing the right thing, whether I was equipped for the task at hand, and whether I could bear the burden of leadership any longer. There were moments when I felt utterly inadequate. What too much to bear. I remember sitting in my office, the walls closing in on me, feeling overwhelmed by the responsibilities and the pressure. At that moment, I found myself praying for the first time in weeks, not for more strength, not for clarity, but simply for God to hold me. I had nothing left to give. All I could do was ask Him to hold me firm, to sustain me, to give me the courage to keep going. And in that moment of desperation, I felt God's presence in a way I had never experienced before. It wasn't an overwhelming sense of physical strength or miraculous clarity, but it was a deep, abiding peace that reminded me that His hand was still with me, still holding me steady, still guiding me through. I was reminded of Psalm 37:24, where the psalmist says, "Though he fall, he shall not be cast headlong, for the Lord upholds his hand." God was holding me through the struggle, not because I had done anything to deserve it, but because I had done anything to deserve it, but because His faithfulness never wavers. And this is the beauty of God's hand. It's not dependent on our perfection, our abilities, or our strength. It is a hand that holds us firmly because He is faithful, even when we are not. This truth became all the more clear as I walked through that season. And as I look back, I am so grateful for it. There were times when I had to trust that God's hand would guide me even when I couldn't see what lay ahead. In those moments, I could feel God's hand, not only upholding me, but also leading me step by step, gently guiding me, even when the path was unclear. It was as if He was saying, "Don't worry about the next 100 steps, John. Just take the next one and trust that I will be there for every step after that." That simple act of trusting Him day by day, minute by minute, is where I found peace. I had to let go of my own sense of control, stop trying to fix everything, and simply rely on God's hand to lead me. And in doing so, I found strength I never knew I had. It was God's hand that held me steady. It was His hand that kept me from falling apart. And it was His hand that led me to a place of renewed strength and purpose. But as I've walked through life, I've learned that the challenges we face are often not just one-time events. They don't always resolve quickly. Sometimes the storms of life stretch on for what seems like an eternity. And yet, it is in those prolonged seasons that I have come to depend even more on the constant, unchanging reality of God's hand. I remember a time when I faced a prolonged health issue that left me exhausted and uncertain. It was a season of waiting for answers, waiting for healing, waiting for relief. The uncertainty of not knowing what the outcome would be was incredibly difficult. During this time, I found myself again turning to the comfort of God's Word. And once again, the promise of God's hand upholding me became my lifeline. Isaiah 41:10 says, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." In those moments, I clung to this promise as a source of peace and confidence. The physical challenges I was facing were real, but the truth of God's sustaining hand was more real. His hand wasn't just with me in the beginning of the journey. It was with me every single day, upholding me, strengthening me, and carrying me through. This is what it means to trust in God's hand through every challenge, to recognize that His hand is not a one-time rescue, but a continual, daily presence in our lives. It's not just when we're at our lowest point that we need His hand. It's every moment. And the beauty of this truth is that God's hand doesn't grow weary. It doesn't grow tired of holding us. His hand is not like ours, which can only hold so much. God's hand can hold us through any trial, no matter how long or how difficult it may seem. Whether we are facing the daily grind of life's demands or going through a season of deep personal hardship, God's hand is there, holding us firmly, guiding us, and giving us the strength to press on. It is in those moments when we are completely dependent on God's hand that we learn the true meaning of peace. the peace that comes from knowing that we are being held by the one who created the universe, the one whose power never fails, the one whose love is never ending. I think about how many of us at times have felt like we're holding on to life by a thread. But I can assure you that when we trust in God's hand, we are not just holding on by a thread. We are being held by a firm, strong hand that will never let go. There is no trial, no challenge, no suffering that can separate us from His love or His care. Romans 8:39 reminds us that nothing will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. That love is expressed in His hand, which is always there to hold us, to guide us, and to strengthen us. I can tell you from personal experience that this is a truth worth clinging to. No matter what comes your way, you can trust that God's hand will hold you firmly through every challenge. And when you rely on His hand, you will find the strength and peace to continue moving forward, knowing that you are not alone. He is with you, holding you, and guiding you every step of the way. As I reflect on God's unfailing promise to hold us firmly through every challenge we face, I am struck by how often we, as believers, find ourselves standing at the crossroads of fear and faith. There are moments in life when the trials we face seem insurmountable, when the weight of responsibility and difficulty presses in on us from every side. I have experienced such moments in my own life. Times when I wasn't sure how I would carry on, when everything seemed overwhelming and when the path ahead appeared unclear. One particular moment comes to mind that forever changed my understanding of God's promise to hold us firmly. It was several years ago, during a time of immense strain in both my personal and professional life. I'd been facing multiple pressures from all directions: ministry challenges, family concerns, and the loss of some close friends that weighed heavily on my heart. It seemed as if each day brought new difficulties, and I found myself waking up each morning wondering how I would make it through the day. The burden felt unbearable, and the questions in my heart began to grow louder. Why is this happening? God, where are you in the midst of this? How long must I endure this trial? In that season, I found myself praying like never before, not for answers, but simply for God to uphold me, to hold me firm in the storm. I remember one evening in particular, after a particularly hard day, I sat in my study with my Bible open, searching for comfort. As I read through the Psalms, I came across Psalm 63:8. My soul clings to you. Your right hand upholds me. Those words struck me deeply. I had heard them many times before, but in that moment, they became more than just words on a page. They became a lifeline. I realized that it wasn't about my ability to endure on my own or about finding the right solutions to my problems. It was about trusting in the unchanging, powerful hand of God to hold me through it all. It was as if God Himself was reminding me that I didn't have to figure everything out or carry the burden on my own. His hand was there, firmly holding me, offering the strength I needed to continue, even when I didn't feel like I could go on. As I meditated on this truth, I came to understand something profound. God's hand isn't simply an abstract promise or a vague sense of comfort. It is a real, active force in our lives. His hand is a hand that provides protection, guidance, and strength. It's a hand that upholds us when we are weak, supports us when we are weary, and holds us steady when the storms of life rage around us. I began to realize that the trials I was facing were not a sign that God had abandoned me, but that He was using those very trials to teach me to depend more fully on His hand. When everything else is uncertain, we can take refuge in the certain. We can take refuge in the certainty that God's hand is holding us securely. This is not a hand that falters or grows tired. This is the hand of the Almighty, the same hand that created the universe, that holds the stars in place, and that sustains all of creation. And this hand is the same hand that reaches down to hold us in our time of need. Through this season of difficulty, I learned something incredibly important. God's hand is not only with us in the beginning of the storm, but it is with us through every moment of the storm. The trials didn't end as quickly as I had hoped, but as I continued to trust in God's hand, I began to experience peace in the midst of the uncertainty. I realized that God's promise to uphold me wasn't contingent on the outcome of my situation. It was about His faithful presence in the midst of it. There were days when I felt weak, when I wasn't sure if I had the strength to face another challenge, but in those moments, I found the sustaining power of God's hand. I remember the feeling of peace that would wash over me, not because my circumstances had changed, but because I knew that God's hand was holding me firmly and would never let go. And as I look back on that season now, I can see that God's hand didn't just hold me through the trial. It strengthened me, refined me, and drew me closer to Himself. It's in the difficult moments when we are pressed on every side that we often experience the deepest moments of growth and transformation. As I relied on God's hand to hold me, I realized that my trust in Him deepened. My dependence on His strength became more profound. I began to understand in a new way what it means to walk by faith, to trust that He is always with me, even when I can't see the way forward. And this is a lesson that I believe God continues to teach me today. Life is full of challenges, and there will always be times when the road ahead seems uncertain, but the promise remains. God's hand will hold us firmly through every challenge. This is a promise that I have seen play out in countless lives over the years, and it's a promise I hold on to in my own life. I think of the many people I've counseled through their own struggles, the families who have lost loved ones, the individuals who have faced financial ruin, the people who have battled illness or anxiety, and in each of those situations, I've seen God's hand at work. His hand is a hand of mercy, comfort, and grace. It's a hand that doesn't just meet us in the good times, but especially in the bad. And especially in the bad. And it's in the bad times, when we feel the most vulnerable, that we experience the depth of His love and care for us. I've learned that there's nothing too big or too small for God's hand to hold, whether you're facing a momentary struggle or a prolonged trial. God's hand is with you, holding you, guiding you, and sustaining you. And no matter how hard the road may seem, He will never let go. I know that some of you may be facing challenges right now that feel overwhelming. Maybe you are dealing with a financial crisis, a health issue, or a family situation that seems beyond repair. Maybe you are walking through a season of grief, of doubt, or of fear about the future. But I want to encourage you with this truth. God's hand will hold you firmly. You are not alone. His hand will uphold you. It will guide you. It will provide for you, and it will never fail. No matter how long the struggle lasts, no matter how dark the path seems, God's hand will always be with you, holding you steady and secure. Trust in His unfailing care today. Let go of your fears and uncertainties and rest in the promise that God's hand will hold you firmly through every challenge you face.